What if I told you that the woman who nearly destroyed my life was about to receive a community service award for being an outstanding mother figure? What if I told you that same woman had broken my collarbone when I was 14 and my own father helped her cover it up? And what if I told you that 10 years later, I walked into that award ceremony with a manila envelope that would shatter her perfect reputation forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandelier above the community center ballroom cast dancing shadows across the cream-colored walls, where elegant banners proclaimed, "Honoring our community champions," in flowing gold script. The air buzzed with refined conversation, the gentle clinking of champagne flutes, and the rustle of expensive fabric as Millbrook's most prominent families mingled in their finest attire. Fresh white orchids adorned every table, their pristine petals catching the warm light, while uniformed servers glided between clusters of guests, carrying silver trays laden with delicate hors d'oeuvres. I stood at the entrance of the ballroom, my heart hammering against my ribs as I took in the scene before me. The ivory silk dress I'd chosen hugged my frame perfectly, its subtle shimmer catching the light as I moved. My dark hair was swept into an elegant updo, secured with the pearl pins that had belonged to my grandmother. I looked every inch the successful young professional I'd fought to become, but underneath the polished exterior, old wounds throbbed with familiar pain. Tonight was the annual Millbrook Community Service Awards, an event that drew the town's elite to celebrate those who'd made significant contributions to local causes. And tonight, my stepmother Victoria was being honored as outstanding mentor to youth for her work with the local children's shelter. The irony was so thick I could taste it. As I stepped further into the ballroom, my eyes instinctively searched the crowd until they found her. There she was, radiant in a floor-length emerald gown that complemented her blonde hair perfectly. She stood near the podium, surrounded by admirers, her laugh ringing out like silver bells as she graciously accepted compliments on her charitable work. The mayor's wife clutched her arm, speaking animatedly about Victoria's dedication to helping disadvantaged children find stable homes. If only they knew the truth about the home she'd created for me. Victoria's gaze swept across the room and landed on me. For just a moment, I saw her freeze, her smile faltering as our eyes met across the crowded space. But she recovered quickly, as she always did, transforming her momentary shock into a look of pleasant surprise. She excused herself from her admirers and began making her way toward me, her movements graceful and deliberate. "Lydia, darling," she said as she approached, her voice carrying that familiar tone of forced warmth. "What a lovely surprise! I wasn't expecting to see you here tonight." Her eyes flickered over my appearance, taking in every detail with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent years trying to find fault with me. "Hello, Victoria," I replied, keeping my voice steady and pleasant. "Congratulations on your award. It must feel wonderful to be recognized for your work with children." A small crowd had begun to gather around us, drawn by the subtle tension they could sense but couldn't quite identify. I recognized several faces from my childhood, neighbors and family friends who'd watched me grow up but had never known the truth about what happened behind closed doors. "Oh, you're too kind," Victoria said, waving her hand dismissively. "Though I have to say it's rather unexpected to see you at an event like this. These gatherings can be quite overwhelming for some people." Her words were carefully chosen, designed to make me feel out of place while maintaining her image of benevolent concern. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been my third-grade teacher, stepped closer. "Lydia, how wonderful to see you, dear. Are you here with your father?" Before I could answer, Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, Robert couldn't make it tonight. He's been feeling under the weather lately. You know how it is with men and their little ailments." She laughed, and several people chuckled along with her. But isn't it sweet that Lydia decided to come support me anyway, despite everything? Those last two words hung in the air like a challenge. Despite everything. As if I was the problem, the difficult stepdaughter who'd made life challenging for the saint who'd tried so hard to love me. Despite everything, I repeated quietly, letting the phrase settle between us. Yes, I suppose you could say that. The crowd around us had grown larger, their curiosity piqued by the undercurrent of tension in our exchange. I could see Victoria's mind working, trying to figure out my angle, wondering why I'd come tonight and what I might be planning. She'd always been skilled at reading people, at identifying their weaknesses and exploiting them. It's how she'd managed to convince everyone, including my father, that I was a troubled child who needed her firm guidance. Well, Vic's silent auction has some lovely pieces this year. Perhaps you'll find something within your budget. The subtle condescension in her voice was unmistakable to anyone who knew her well, though it would sound like innocent concern to casual observers. I smiled, feeling remarkably calm despite the familiar sting of her words. Actually, Victoria, I was hoping we could talk. Privately. There's something I think you should see before the ceremony begins. For just a moment, I saw her freeze, genuine uncertainty flickering across her features. Oh? Whatever could you mean? I reached into my small clutch and withdrew a manila envelope, holding it casually at my side. It's about the past. About that accident when I was 14. You remember, don't you? When I supposedly slipped on the stairs. The color drained from her face so quickly that several people in our circle glanced at her with concern. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Victoria. Are you all right, dear? You look pale. I'm fine, Victoria said quickly, her voice slightly strained. Just a little warm in here. But her eyes never left the envelope in my hand. The memories came flooding back as I stood there watching her squirm. I was 14 again, lying at the bottom of the basement stairs with pain shooting through my left shoulder and arm. I could still feel the cold concrete against my cheek, still remember the taste of blood in my mouth from where I'd bitten my tongue during the fall. Except it hadn't been a fall, had it? I'd been late coming home from school that day, having stayed after to work on a science project with my lab partner. Victoria had been waiting for me in the kitchen, her face already flushed with anger.
"This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising to a pitch that several people noticed. "You're making a scene at a charity event, disrupting an evening meant to honor community service. This is exactly the kind of behavior that your father and I had to deal with throughout your teenage years." But her words rang hollow now, desperate and shrill compared to my calm demeanor. The people watching could see the difference between us, could sense who was telling the truth and who was scrambling to maintain a lie. "You're right," I said, nodding thoughtfully. "This is about community service. It's about serving the community by ensuring that people who claim to help children are actually qualified to do so. It's about making sure that awards for outstanding mentorship go to people who actually deserve them." I opened the manila envelope and withdrew a thick stack of papers, holding them up so that several people in the crowd could see the official hospital letterhead at the top of each page. "These are copies of my complete medical records from the night of my accident, along with a sworn affidavit from Dr. Martinez explaining what those records actually reveal about my injuries." Victoria lunged forward, trying to grab the papers from my hands. "You can't do this. This is a private matter. You have no right to air family business in public." But I've stepped back smoothly, keeping the documents out of her reach. "Family business?" I asked, raising my voice so that everyone in the vicinity could hear me clearly. "Is that what you call it when you pushed a 14-year-old girl down a flight of concrete stairs? When you convinced her father that she was lying about what happened? When you spent years making her feel like she was crazy for remembering the truth?" A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Several people stepped back from Victoria as if she were suddenly toxic, their faces reflecting shock and disgust. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been standing loyally beside Victoria just moments before, moved away with a look of horror. "That's not true," Victoria shouted, abandoning all pretense of composure.
She's lying. She's always been a liar, a manipulative little girl who could never accept that her father found happiness with someone else. This is just another one of her schemes to turn people against me." But even as she spoke, I could see doubt creeping into the faces of those who'd known her for years. They were beginning to see cracks in the perfect facade she'd maintained, beginning to question stories they'd accepted without thought. Dr. Martinez chose that moment to appear at my side, her presence lending immediate credibility to my claims. She was a distinguished woman in her 60s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her reputation in the community was beyond reproach, and her arrival sent another wave of whispers through the crowd. "Lydia," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority of her profession and her years of experience, "I'm glad you decided to come forward. It takes tremendous courage to speak the truth about childhood abuse, especially when it's been covered up for so long." The word abuse hung in the air like a thunderclap. Victoria's face contorted with rage and desperation. "This is insane! Sarah, you can't possibly believe this nonsense. Tell them that children make up stories, that traumatic events can cause false memories." Dr. Martinez fixed Victoria with a steady, professional gaze. "I believe the medical evidence," she said, simply. "And the medical evidence clearly shows that Lydia's injuries were consistent with being pushed, not with an accidental fall. The bruising patterns, the angle of the fracture, the secondary impact injuries, everything points to intentional violence, not clumsiness." The crowd had grown to encompass nearly half the ballroom now, drawn by the commotion and the shocking revelations. The mayor himself had appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face grim as he took in the scene. "Furthermore," Dr. Martinez continued, her voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet space, "I've reviewed the psychiatric evaluations that were conducted after Lydia's injury. The notes clearly indicate that she consistently maintained her story about being pushed, despite pressure from family members to change her account. The attending psychiatrist noted that her memories were clear, consistent, and showed none of the hallmarks of false or manufactured recollections." Victoria's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she reached for a nearby chair to steady herself. The emerald gown that had looked so elegant moments before now seemed garish against her pale, sweating skin. "This isn't happening," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "This can't be happening." But it was happening, and there was no stopping it now. The truth that had been buried for 10 years was finally coming to light, and Victoria's carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. I stepped forward, close enough that she could see the steel in my eyes. "Did you really think I would stay silent forever?" I asked, quietly, my voice carrying only to her, despite the crowd of onlookers. "Did you think I would let you be honored as a protector of children when you're the very person children need protection from?" "The award committee will need to reconsider tonight's honor," the mayor announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Given these serious allegations and the medical evidence that's been presented, it would be inappropriate to proceed with the ceremony as planned." Victoria whirled to face him, her composure completely shattered now. "You can't do this. I've devoted years to this community. I've raised thousands of dollars for charity. One person's lies can't destroy everything I built." "One person's truth," I corrected, my voice steady and clear. "One person's truth that you tried to bury with lies and manipulation and gaslighting. But the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, doesn't it, Victoria? No matter how deep you try to bury it." The crowd began to part as security personnel arrived, clearly uncertain about how to handle the situation, but recognizing that some form of intervention was necessary. Victoria looked around wildly, searching for supporters, for anyone who might still believe her version of events. But the faces staring back at her were filled with shock, disgust, and dawning comprehension. "This is exactly why she could never fit into our family. She's always been jealous, always been resentful. She couldn't accept that her father moved on after her mother died. She spent years plotting this revenge." She'd found out that I'd been accepted into the advanced placement program for the following year, an honor that would have made any normal parent proud. But Victoria wasn't normal, and she certainly wasn't proud. "Who do you think you are?" she'd hissed, waving the acceptance letter in front of my face, "acting like you're better than everyone else, like you deserve special treatment." I'd tried to explain that the program would help me get into a good college, that it was an opportunity I'd worked hard for. But Victoria had been beyond reason. In her mind, my success was somehow a threat to her, a reminder that I wasn't really her daughter and never would be. The argument had escalated quickly, following me as I tried to retreat to my room. She'd cornered me at the top of the basement stairs, her face twisted with rage, as she screamed about ungrateful children and know-it-all teenagers who thought they were too good for their families. And then, in a moment of pure fury, she'd shoved me. The impact had been devastating. I'd tumbled down 15 concrete steps, my body twisting and bouncing until I'd landed in a crumpled heap at the bottom. The pain in my shoulder had been immediate and excruciating, a white-hot agony that had made me cry out before unconsciousness mercifully claimed me. When I'd woken up, my father was kneeling beside me, his face creased with worry. Victoria stood behind him, already spinning her tale of how I'd been rushing upstairs and had tripped over my own feet. "You know how clumsy she can be," she'd said, her voice perfectly pitched between concern and exasperation. "I've told her 100 times to slow down, but teenagers never listen." At the hospital, the story had been repeated so many times, it had taken on the weight of truth. Lydia had fallen down the stairs. Lydia had been careless. Lydia was lucky the break wasn't worse. The doctors had focused on treating my injuries rather than questioning how they'd occurred, and my father had nodded along with Victoria's version of events, either unwilling or unable to see the truth. But hospitals keep records, detailed records, and those records noted inconsistencies between the story we'd told and the actual pattern of my injuries. They'd noted the bruising on my back, where Victoria's hands had made contact. They'd documented the angle of the break, which suggested I'd been pushed rather than simply fallen. They'd recorded everything, even if no one had been brave enough to ask the right questions at the time. "Lydia," Victoria said now, her voice carefully controlled, "I think you might be confused about something. Perhaps we should discuss this later when you've had time to think clearly." "Oh, I've had plenty of time to think," I replied, my voice steady and clear. 10 years, to be exact. 10 years to remember every detail of that day. 10 years to wonder why my own father chose to believe your story instead of asking me what really happened. The crowd around us had fallen silent, sensing that something significant was unfolding before their eyes. Several more people had drifted over, drawn by the tension that crackled between Victoria and me like electricity before a storm. "I don't know what you're implying," Victoria said, but her voice had risen slightly, betraying her growing panic. "You fell down the stairs. Everyone knows that. Your father was there. The doctors treated your injuries. Case closed." "Case closed," I repeated, nodding slowly. "That's what you thought, wasn't it? That your perfect little lie would stay buried forever, that no one would ever question the official story, that I would just accept what happened and move on with my life." I held up the manila envelope, watching as Victoria's eyes fixed on it with unmistakable dread. "But the thing about hospitals, Victoria, is that they're very thorough. They document everything. Every bruise, every cut, every inconsistency. And when you know what to look for, when you know which questions to ask, those records can tell a very different story than the one you and my father told." The silence in our corner of the ballroom was deafening. Even the background chatter from other parts of the room seemed to have faded away, as if the entire event had paused to witness this moment of reckoning. "I don't know what you're implying," Victoria said, but her voice was shaking now. "But you're obviously confused. Traumatic events can sometimes create false memories, especially in young people. Perhaps you should speak to someone about this, get some professional help." It was a masterful deflection, exactly the kind of manipulation she'd perfected over the years. Plant doubt, suggest mental instability, make the victim question their own reality. She'd used similar tactics throughout my teenage years, convincing my father that my complaints about her treatment were just teenage rebellion, that my injuries and accidents were simply the result of my own clumsiness and poor judgment. But I wasn't 14 anymore. I wasn't confused or uncertain or easily manipulated. I was 24 years old, with a medical degree and enough knowledge to understand exactly what those hospital records meant. More importantly, I had allies now, people who'd helped me uncover the truth and were prepared to stand behind me when I revealed it. Professional help, I said, savoring the irony. That's exactly what I sought, Victoria. Professional help from Dr. Sarah Martinez, the head of orthopedic surgery at Millbrook General. Do you remember Dr. Martinez? She was one of the physicians who treated me that night. She's also the woman you're supposedly helping by raising money for the children's shelter. Victoria's face had gone from pale to ashen. She glanced desperately around the room, looking for an escape route, or perhaps hoping my father would somehow materialize to support her story. But my father wasn't coming. He was at home, claiming illness, though I suspect he simply couldn't bear to watch Victoria receive an award for helping children when he knew, deep down, what she'd done to his own daughter.
And for just a moment, I saw some people in the crowd wavering, uncertainty flickering across their faces. But Dr. Martinez stepped forward again, her medical authority cutting through Victoria's desperate manipulation. "Mrs. Whitman," she said, using Victoria's full name with pointed formality, "I've been practicing medicine for over 30 years. I've seen hundreds of cases of child abuse, and I've learned to recognize the patterns of behavior that both abusers and their victims display. Your reaction tonight, your immediate attempts to discredit and gaslight your victim, your refusal to acknowledge the medical evidence, these are textbook responses from someone who's been caught in a long-standing pattern of abuse." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. She stumbled backward, her hand pressed to her chest as if she couldn't breathe. "No," she gasped. "No, that's not what this is. You don't understand. She was difficult. She was always difficult. I tried to help her, tried to be a good mother figure, but she fought me every step of the way." "A good mother figure?" I repeated, my voice filled with quiet incredulity. "Is that what you call pushing a child down the stairs? Is that what you call convincing her father that she was a liar? Is that what you call years of emotional manipulation and psychological abuse?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. The perfect image she'd cultivated for years was dissolving before everyone's eyes, revealing the toxic reality that had been hidden underneath. A woman I recognized as the director of the children's shelter pushed through the crowd, her face pale with shock. "Victoria?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is this true? Did you really hurt this girl?" Victoria turned to her with desperate hope, grasping at this potential lifeline. "Margaret, you know me. You know the work I've done with the children at the shelter. You've seen how good I am with them, how much I care. This is all a misunderstanding, a vindictive attack from someone who's never been able to move past her childhood issues." But Margaret stepped back, shaking her head slowly. "The children at the shelter?" she said, her voice growing stronger as realization dawned. "Some of them have told me things about you, small things that I dismissed at the time, but now, the way you talk to them when you think no one is listening, the way they sometimes flinch when you reach for them. I thought I was imagining things, but now I wonder if I should have paid more attention." The revelation hit the crowd like a shockwave. If Victoria had been inappropriate with the children she was supposedly helping, then her pattern of abuse extended far beyond her treatment of me. The scope of her deception and manipulation was becoming clear, and the horror of it was written on every face in the room. "This is insane," Victoria shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that made several people wince. "You're all crazy. Margaret, those children are damaged. They make things up. They see threats where none exist. You can't believe the fantasies of traumatized children."
But her protests only served to dig her grave deeper. With every word, she revealed more of her true nature, her contempt for the very people she claimed to help. The mask was completely off now, and the ugly reality underneath was impossible to ignore. I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me as I watched Victoria's world collapse. For years, I dreamed of this moment. Imagine what it would feel like to finally expose her for what she really was. But now that it was happening, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction in her downfall. I felt only relief that the truth was finally being heard, that other children might be protected from the harm she could cause. "The police will need to be involved," the mayor said grimly, pulling out his phone. "If there are children at risk, if there's been ongoing abuse, this can't be handled as a simple charity event disruption." Victoria's face went white at the mention of police. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, you can't involve the police. This is a private family matter. Lydia is just upset. She's confused about what happened. She needs help, not legal intervention." But her protests fell on deaf ears. The crowd had heard enough, seen enough to understand that this was far more serious than a simple family disagreement. The woman they'd gathered to honor as an outstanding mentor to children was revealed to be someone from whom children needed protection. Dr. Martinez placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. "I know this must be incredibly difficult for you." I nodded, surprising myself with how steady I felt. "I'm okay," I said. "I'm better than okay, actually. For the first time in 10 years, I feel like I can breathe." As if on cue, the ballroom doors opened and several police officers entered, their presence adding an official gravity to the proceedings. Officer Chen, whom I recognized from my preparations for this evening, approached our group with professional calm. "Miss Sterling," he said, addressing me formally, "we received your call. Are you ready to proceed with your statement?" I had called them earlier, of course. This confrontation hadn't been spontaneous or emotional. It had been carefully planned, meticulously prepared, with legal counsel and law enforcement support arranged. I'd learned from Victoria's own playbook. Plan ahead, control the narrative, and always have evidence to back up your claims.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Yes, Officer Chen," I replied clearly. "I'm ready to provide a full statement about the abuse I suffered as a minor, including the incident that resulted in my broken collarbone and the subsequent cover-up." Victoria made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "This is harassment," she shouted at the officers. "This woman is mentally unstable. She's disrupting a charity event with false accusations. I demand that you remove her." But Officer Chen's expression remained professional and unmoved. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "we've already reviewed the medical evidence and witness statements that Ms. Sterling provided to our department. We're here to investigate serious allegations of child abuse and conspiracy to cover up that abuse. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right until you can speak with an attorney." The words, "you have the right to remain silent," seemed to echo through the ballroom, causing another wave of shocked murmurs from the crowd. This wasn't just a public confrontation anymore. It was the beginning of a criminal investigation. Victoria's legs finally gave out completely, and she sank into a nearby chair, her head in her hands. The emerald gown that had made her look so regal at the beginning of the evening was now wrinkled and disheveled, a perfect metaphor for the destruction of her carefully maintained image. "I want to press charges," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the now silent ballroom, "for assault, for child abuse, and for conspiracy to cover up those crimes. I also want a full investigation into her interactions with the children at the shelter." Margaret, the shelter director, stepped forward immediately. "We'll cooperate fully with any investigation," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "The safety of our children is our primary concern. If Victoria has been inappropriate with any of them, we need to know immediately." As the police began their formal procedures, I found myself surrounded by people I'd known since childhood, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, sympathy, and admiration. Mrs. Henderson approached me with tears in her eyes. "Lydia, dear," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "I'm so sorry. If we had known, if anyone had suspected, it's not your fault, I assured her. Victoria was very good at hiding the truth. She convinced everyone, including my father, that I was the problem. That's what abusers do. They isolate their victims and make everyone believe that the victim is unreliable or unstable. Dr. Martinez nodded grimly. It's a classic pattern, she confirmed. The abuser maintains a perfect public image while systematically destroying their victim's credibility. It's one of the reasons why cases like this can remain hidden for years. As Victoria was led away by the police, she turned back one last time, her eyes meeting mine across the crowded ballroom. For just a moment, I saw something in her expression that might have been regret, or perhaps just the final death of her hope that she could talk her way out of this situation. "This isn't over," she said, her voice barely audible but filled with venom. "People like you always think they've won, but you don't understand the consequences of destroying someone's life." I met her gaze steadily, feeling no fear, only a profound sense of closure. "You're right," I said clearly. "This isn't over, but you're wrong about who destroyed whose life. You destroyed mine when I was 14 years old. Tonight, I'm finally reclaiming it." And with that, Victoria Whitman was escorted from the ballroom, her reign of manipulation and abuse finally at an end. As the crowd began to disperse, many people approached me to offer their support and to express their shock at what they'd witnessed. The mayor made a brief announcement that the evening's program would be postponed while the allegations were investigated, and that the community would be implementing new screening procedures for all volunteers who worked with children. I stood in the now quiet ballroom, still holding the manila envelope that had started it all, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. For 10 years, I'd carried the weight of Victoria's lies, the pain of being dismissed and disbelieved by the people who should have protected me. Tonight, that weight had finally been lifted. Dr. Martinez approached me one last time before leaving. "What you did tonight took incredible courage," she said. "You may have saved other children from experiencing what you went through." I nodded, thinking about the children at the shelter, about other potential victims who might have crossed Victoria's path. "That's what matters," I said, "making sure this never happens to anyone else." As I finally prepared to leave the ballroom, I caught sight of my reflection in one of the large mirrors that lined the walls. The woman looking back at me was strong, confident, and free. She bore little resemblance to the frightened, gaslit 14-year-old who was convinced she was crazy for remembering the truth about what happened to her. I walked out of that ballroom with my head held high, knowing that I had finally found my voice and used it to speak the truth that had been silenced for too long. Victoria's perfect facade had crumbled, her web of lies had been exposed, and justice would finally be served. The little girl who had been pushed down those stairs 10 years ago had grown up into a woman who refused to be pushed around anymore. And that, more than any award or recognition, was the greatest victory of all. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I pulled out my phone and dialed my father's number. It was time for another difficult conversation, time to confront the man who had chosen to believe Victoria's lies over his own daughter's truth. But that was a battle for another day. Tonight, I had won the war against the woman who had tried to destroy me. And tomorrow, I would begin the process of helping other victims find their own voices, their own strength, their own paths to justice. The truth, as I had learned, really does have a way of surfacing eventually. It just sometimes takes a woman with a manila envelope and the courage to use it to bring it into the light. The drive to my childhood home felt like traveling through a time warp. Each familiar street corner and landmark bringing back memories I'd spent years trying to suppress. The autumn leaves crunched under my tires as I pulled into the driveway of the colonial house where I'd grown up, its white shutters and manicured lawns still maintaining the picture-perfect facade that Victoria had always been so obsessed with preserving. My father's car sat in the garage, and I could see the faint glow of the television through the living room window. He was home, probably watching the late news, completely unaware that his wife had just been arrested at the community center less than 2 miles away. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the steering wheel, steeling myself for what was about to be the most difficult conversation of my life. The front door key still worked, though I'd rarely used it in the years since I had moved out for college. The house smelled exactly the same, a mixture of Victoria's expensive perfume and the lavender air freshener she sprayed obsessively throughout the rooms. Family photos lined the hallway, carefully curated images that told the story Victoria wanted the world to see. A loving blended family where everyone was happy and content. "Dad," I called out, my voice echoing through the quiet house.
Lydia? His voice came from the living room, filled with surprise and confusion. What are you doing here so late? Is everything all right? I found him in his usual spot, settled into the worn leather recliner that had been his favorite for as long as I could remember. Robert Sterling looked older than his 58 years, his hair now completely gray and his face lined with the kind of weariness that comes from years of willful ignorance. He was wearing his standard evening uniform of flannel pajamas and an old college sweatshirt, the remote control balanced on the arm of his chair. "We need to talk," I said, remaining standing in the doorway. The formal tone of my voice must have alerted him that this wasn't a casual visit, because he immediately muted the television and turned to face me fully. "Of course, sweetheart. Come sit down. Can I get you something to drink? You look upset." The casual endearment stung more than I'd expected. He'd always called me sweetheart, even during those terrible years when he'd consistently chosen Victoria's version of events over mine. It was one of the ways he'd maintained the illusion that everything was fine, that he was still a loving father, even while he allowed his wife to systematically abuse his daughter. "Victoria was arrested tonight," I said, without preamble, watching as the color drained from his face. He blinked several times, as if trying to process information that didn't compute. "Arrested? That's impossible. She's at the Community Service Awards. She's receiving an honor for her work with the children's shelter." "She was at the award ceremony," I confirmed, moving into the room, but still refusing to sit. Right up until the moment the police led her away in handcuffs for child abuse and conspiracy to cover up assault. My father's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his hands gripping the arms of his recliner until his knuckles turned white. "Child abuse? Lydia, what are you talking about? Victoria has dedicated years of her life to helping children. She would never hurt a child." The irony of his words was almost overwhelming. He was so completely invested in Victoria's public image that he couldn't see the contradiction in his own statement. She would never hurt a child, he said, while sitting in the same house where she had systematically tormented his own daughter for years. "She hurt me, Dad," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my chest. "She hurt me repeatedly, and you chose to believe her lies instead of protecting your own child." He shook his head vehemently, standing up from his chair with more energy than I'd seen from him in years. "That's not true. Victoria tried so hard with you, Lydia. She wanted to be a good stepmother, but you made it impossible. You were angry about your mother's death, angry that I'd remarried, and you took it out on Victoria at every opportunity." It was the same narrative that had been repeated in our house for years, the official family story that painted me as the problem and Victoria as the long-suffering victim. Hearing him recite it again, even now, even after everything that had happened tonight, made me realize just how deep Victoria's manipulation had gone. "I was angry about Mom's death," I agreed, my voice growing stronger. "I was a grieving 13-year-old who'd lost the most important person in her world. But I never took it out on Victoria. I tried to accept her, tried to make her like me, tried to be the daughter she wanted me to be. And when that didn't work, when she made it clear that nothing I did would ever be good enough, I tried to just stay out of her way." "You were defiant," my father insisted, his voice rising with the passion of someone defending a deeply held belief. "You questioned her authority, refused to follow her rules, made her feel unwelcome in her own home. Victoria would come to me in tears, telling me how hard she was trying and how you rejected every attempt she made to connect with you." The image he painted was so far from reality that I almost laughed. Victoria in tears, portraying herself as the wounded party, while she systematically destroyed a child's sense of self-worth. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and my father had been the perfect target. A grieving widower who wanted so desperately to believe that his new wife could heal his broken family. "Did she cry when she told you I had fallen down the basement stairs?" I asked, pulling the manila envelope from my purse. "Did she seem upset when she described how clumsy I was? How I'd tripped over my own feet rushing up from the laundry room?" My father's face went pale at the mention of that night. "You did fall," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You broke your collarbone. We took you to the hospital. The doctors treated your injuries." "The doctors documented evidence that I'd been pushed," I said, withdrawing the medical records from the envelope. "They noted bruising patterns consistent with handprints on my back. They recorded that the angle of my fracture was inconsistent with an accidental fall. They wrote down their concerns about the inconsistencies between our story and my actual injuries." I held out the papers, watching as my father stared at them without taking them. "Dr. Martinez, who treated me that night, has signed an affidavit stating that my injuries were consistent with intentional violence, not an accident." "That's impossible," he whispered, but his eyes scanned the official documentation with growing disbelief. "The bruising on her back is consistent with impact from 2 adult hands? The fracture pattern suggests significant force from above and behind the victim? The story provided by family members does not align with the physical evidence observed." He looked up at me, his face ashen. "Why didn't they say anything? Why didn't the doctors tell me this at the time?" "They tried," I said gently, feeling a mixture of anger and pity for the man who failed to protect me when I needed him the most.
Martinez attempted to discuss her concerns with you privately, but Victoria interrupted every conversation. She was always there, always controlling the narrative, always ensuring that you heard her version of events rather than the medical facts. My father sank back into his recliner, the papers fluttering to the floor around him. "I don't understand," he said, his voice broken. "Why would she lie? Why would she hurt you and then lie about it?" It was the question I'd asked myself thousands of times over the years, trying to understand the psychology of a woman who could harm a child and then convince everyone that the child was the problem. The answer I'd learned through years of therapy and research was both simple and complicated. "Because she saw me as a threat," I explained, sitting down across from him for the first time since I'd arrived. "I was a reminder of your first marriage, of a life you'd had before her. Every achievement I earned, every moment of pride I gave you was proof that your previous family had value. She couldn't tolerate that." "But she always said she wanted to help you," my father protested weakly. "She said she was trying to guide you, to give you structure and discipline." "She was trying to break me," I said quietly. "Every punishment, every criticism, every time she convinced you that I was lying or being dramatic, she was systematically destroying my confidence and my relationship with you. She wanted me to be so damaged, so obviously problematic, that you would eventually choose her over me." The truth hung between us like a physical presence, heavy and undeniable. My father buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with emotion. "Oh God," he whispered. "What have I done? What have I allowed to happen?" For years, I'd imagined this moment, fantasized about the day when my father would finally see the truth and acknowledge what his willful blindness had cost me. I'd expected to feel vindicated, triumphant, satisfied that justice was finally being served. Instead, I felt only a profound sadness for all the years we'd lost, all the damage that could never be undone. "You chose to believe the person you loved instead of investigating the concerns of your child," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You prioritized your marriage over your daughter's safety. Those were choices you made, Dad, and they had consequences." He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. "How can you even stand to be in the same room with me? How can you call me Dad after what I've done?" It was the question I'd wrestled with for years, the complicated love-hate relationship that exists between a child and a parent who failed to protect them. Despite everything, despite the years of feeling abandoned and dismissed, he was still my father, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd read me bedtime stories, who'd held me when my mother died. "Because you're still my father," I said simply. "You made terrible mistakes, but I don't think you made them with malicious intent.
You were manipulated by someone who was very skilled at manipulation. Victoria convinced you that loving her meant accepting her version of reality, even when that reality contradicted your own daughter's experiences. "But I should have known," he said, his voice filled with self-recrimination. "I should have seen the signs. I should have protected you." "Yes," I agreed, because there was no point in softening the truth. You should have. A parent's primary responsibility is to protect their child, and you failed in that responsibility. But Victoria was the one who chose to abuse me. You were an enabler, but she was the perpetrator. My father was silent for a long moment, staring at the medical records scattered around his feet. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "What happens now? What happens to Victoria?" "She's been arrested and charged with assault and child abuse. There will be an investigation into her interactions with the children at the shelter. If other victims come forward, there will be additional charges. She'll likely face prison time." "And us?" he asked, looking at me with desperate hope. "Is there any chance for us? Can we ever repair what's been broken?" It was the question I'd been dreading, the one I didn't have a simple answer for. The relationship between a parent and child who's been failed by that parent is complicated, full of contradictions and competing emotions. Love and resentment, forgiveness and accountability, hope and realistic expectations. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I want to try, but it will require you to fully accept the truth about what happened. Not just the facts about that night when Victoria pushed me, but the years of emotional abuse that followed. You'll need to understand how your choices affected me, how they shaped my ability to trust and form relationships." "I'll do whatever it takes," he said immediately. "Therapy, counseling, whatever you think might help. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to try to build something better for the future." "It won't be easy," I warned him. "There will be moments when you want to defend Victoria, when you want to minimize what happened or make excuses for the choices you made. You'll have to resist those impulses and stay committed to the truth even when it's uncomfortable." "I understand," he said, though I doubted he truly comprehended the emotional journey that lay ahead of us. "Lydia, I know this doesn't change anything, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I failed you in the worst possible way, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." The apology was a start, but apologies alone couldn't heal the damage that had been done. Rebuilding our relationship would require sustained effort, consistent choices to prioritize truth over comfort, and a willingness to confront the painful reality of how his failures had affected my life. My phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Rodriguez, the lead investigator on Victoria's case. The message was brief but significant. "2 children from the shelter have come forward with allegations. Need to schedule interview with you for additional background." I showed the message to my father, watching as his face went even paler. "Other children," he whispered. "She hurt other children." The investigation is just beginning, but it appears that her abuse wasn't limited to me. The children at the shelter have reported inappropriate behavior, verbal abuse, and physical intimidation. Your wife, the woman you defended for years, has been systematically harming vulnerable children while accepting community praise for helping them.
He doubled over in his chair, making a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a moan. "I brought her into our home," he said. "I gave her access to you, defended her actions, enabled her to hurt you and other children. I'm as guilty as she is." "You're guilty of different crimes," I said, feeling the need to be precise about responsibility and accountability. "You're guilty of willful ignorance, of choosing comfort over truth, of failing to protect your child. But Victoria is guilty of deliberate abuse, of calculated manipulation, of using her position of trust to harm vulnerable people. Those are different levels of culpability." "But the children she hurt at the shelter," my father said, his voice breaking. If I had spoken up years ago, if I had investigated your claims instead of dismissing them, those children might have been safe. My silence enabled her to hurt more people. It was true, and there was no point in denying it. Victoria's abuse had been allowed to continue and expand because the adults around her had chosen to accept her public image rather than examining her private behavior. My father's failure to protect me had directly contributed to the harm she'd inflicted on other children. "That's something you'll have to live with," I said, not unkindly, but without false comfort. "The knowledge that your choices had consequences beyond our family. But you can't change the past. What you can do is commit to being truthful going forward, starting with your cooperation with the police investigation." "Of course," he said immediately. "I'll tell them everything. Every time I had doubts, every time you tried to tell me what was happening, every time Victoria convinced me to dismiss your concerns, I'll make sure they understand the full scope of her manipulation." "That would be a start," I agreed. "Your testimony could be crucial in establishing the pattern of abuse and the way Victoria operated. The prosecutors will need to understand how she maintained her facade while systematically harming children." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the evening's revelations settling over us like a heavy blanket. The house that had once been filled with Victoria's carefully orchestrated performances of domestic bliss now felt hollow and haunted, contaminated by the truth of what had really happened within its walls. "I keep thinking about all the times you tried to tell me," my father said suddenly. "All the moments when you looked at me with such desperation, begging me to see what was happening. I convinced myself that you were being dramatic, that teenagers exaggerate everything. But you weren't being dramatic, were you? You were asking for help." "I was asking for help," I confirmed. "I was asking you to believe me, to investigate my claims, to protect me from someone who is systematically destroying my sense of self-worth. Instead, you consistently chose to believe the adult over the child, the wife over the daughter." "The night you moved out for college," he said, his voice filled with regret, "you barely said goodbye. You packed your things while Victoria and I were out, left a note saying you'd call when you got settled. I thought you were just eager to start your new life, but you were escaping, weren't you?" I remembered that night vividly, the desperate relief I'd felt as I loaded my belongings into my car and drove away from the house where I had endured years of psychological torture. Victoria had been furious that I'd been accepted to a prestigious university, had spent months trying to convince my father that I wasn't mature enough to live independently, that I needed more supervision and structure. I was escaping, I admitted. I knew that if I stayed any longer, if I continued to live under Victoria's control, she would eventually succeed in breaking me completely. College was my chance to get away, to discover who I really was without her constant criticism and manipulation. "You were 18 years old," my father said, his voice filled with horror at the realization. "You were just a child, and you felt like you had to run away from your own family to be safe." "I didn't feel like I had to run away," I corrected him. "I had to run away. Victoria had made it clear that as long as I lived in this house, I would be subject to her control and abuse. You had made it clear that you would always take her side over mine. Leaving wasn't a choice. It was a survival strategy." My father's phone rang, startling both of us from our conversation. He glanced at the caller ID and his face went white. "It's Victoria," he said, his voice barely audible. "Don't answer it," I advised. "She's probably been given one phone call from jail, and she's going to try to convince you to bail her out or hire her a lawyer. Anything you say to her now could be used to undermine the prosecution's case." He stared at the phone as it continued to ring, his finger hovering over the answer button. I could see the internal struggle playing out on his face, years of conditioning warring with his newfound understanding of the truth. Victoria had trained him to respond to her needs immediately, to prioritize her comfort over everything else. "She's going to say it's all a misunderstanding," I said gently. "She's going to cry and tell you that I'm lying, that the medical evidence has been falsified, that there's a conspiracy against her. She's going to make you feel guilty for doubting her, for not immediately coming to her rescue." The phone finally stopped ringing and he set it down with shaking hands. "He left a voicemail," he said, staring at the device as if it were a snake. "Don't listen to it,"
I advised. Not tonight. Not until you've had time to fully process what you've learned about her true nature. She's incredibly skilled at manipulation, and right now you're vulnerable to being pulled back into her web of lies. But she's my wife, he said, the words coming out automatically before he seemed to realize how they sounded. She's a woman who abused your daughter and lied about it for 10 years. She's someone who used her position of trust to harm vulnerable people. The fact that you married her doesn't obligate you to enable her continued abuse. The distinction seemed to hit him like a physical blow. For years, he'd conflated loyalty to his wife with being a good husband, not understanding that true loyalty sometimes requires holding people accountable for their actions rather than blindly supporting them. I don't know how to process this, he admitted. I've built my entire life around the belief that Victoria was a good person who was trying to help our family. If that's not true, if she's actually been harming people all along, then everything I thought I knew about my life is a lie. Not everything, I said, trying to offer some small comfort. Your love for me was real, even when you expressed it poorly. Your desire to have a happy family was genuine, even though you chose the wrong methods to achieve it. Victoria's manipulation was so skillful that even mental health professionals initially believed her version of the events. But you should have known your own daughter. You should have recognized when she was in pain, when she was asking for help. What kind of father misses those signs? It was a question that went to the heart of parental responsibility and the complex dynamics of blended families. My father had been grieving, vulnerable, and desperately hoping that his new wife could help heal the wounds left by my mother's death. Victoria had exploited those vulnerabilities masterfully, convincing him that any problems in our household were the result of my inability to accept her rather than her deliberate campaign of psychological abuse.
You were a father who wanted to believe that the woman he loved was good for his family, I said. That doesn't excuse your failure to protect me, but it helps explain how someone who genuinely loved their child could make such devastating mistakes. My father's phone buzzed with a text message, and he glanced at it automatically before his face went even paler. It's from Detective Rodriguez, he said. They want to interview me tomorrow morning about Victoria's behavior and our family dynamics. Good, I said. That's your opportunity to start making amends, to tell the truth about what you observed and what you chose to ignore. The investigators need to understand how Victoria maintained her facade and how she convinced people to dismiss any concerns about her behavior. What if they ask me about specific incidents? He said, anxiety creeping into his voice. What if I can't remember things clearly, or what if my memory conflicts with yours? Tell them the truth, I said simply. Tell them about the times I came to you with complaints about Victoria's treatment, about how she positioned herself as the voice of reason while painting me as problematic. Tell them about the subtle ways she controlled the narrative and managed your perceptions. There were signs, he said suddenly, his voice filled with dawning realization. There were so many signs that I chose to ignore. The way you flinched when Victoria reached for you. The way you stopped talking about your day at school. The way you seemed to shrink into yourself whenever she was around. Yes, I said quietly. There were signs. And every time you dismissed those signs, every time you accepted Victoria's explanations instead of investigating further, you reinforced her power over our household. I remember one night, my father continued, his voice growing stronger as suppressed memories began to surface. You had a nightmare and came to our bedroom crying. Victoria was furious that you'd woken us up, said you were too old to be running to Daddy every time you had a bad dream. She made you go back to your room alone, and when I tried to comfort you, she said I was enabling your attention-seeking behavior. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I remembered that night vividly. The terror that had driven me from my bed seeking comfort. The humiliation of being dismissed as attention-seeking when I was genuinely frightened. It had been one of many moments when Victoria had systematically undermined my relationship with my father, positioning herself as the rational adult and me as the problematic child. I was having nightmares about Mom, I said, my voice barely audible.
I was dreaming that she was calling for me, but I couldn't find her. I needed comfort, and instead I got lectured about appropriate behavior and sent back to my room alone. God, my father whispered, burying his face in his hands again. How many times did that happen? How many times did you need comfort and get criticism instead? How many times did I choose Victoria's convenience over your emotional needs? Too many times to count, I said honestly. But Dad, dwelling on every specific incident won't change what happened. What matters now is that you understand the pattern, that you can help investigators see how Victoria operated and how she maintained control over our family dynamic. My father's phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed an unknown number. Probably a reporter, I said. News of Victoria's arrest is going to spread quickly through the community. You should probably turn off your phone for tonight and let the calls go to voicemail. A reporter, he repeated, as if the concept was foreign to him. This is going to be in the newspapers, isn't it? Everyone in town is going to know what happened. Everyone in town is going to know the truth, I corrected him. They're going to learn that the woman they honored for helping children was actually abusing them. They're going to understand that the perfect family image Victoria cultivated was a carefully constructed lie. But they'll also know that I failed to protect my own daughter, he said, his voice filled with shame. They'll know that I was either complicit or incredibly naive. Either way, I'll be seen as someone who enabled child abuse. Yes, I agreed, because there was no point in sugarcoating the social consequences he would face. Your reputation in the community will be damaged. People will question your judgment and your fitness as a parent. Some will probably blame you as much as they blame Victoria. I deserve that, he said quietly. I deserve whatever consequences come from my failures. Maybe, I said, but what you deserve isn't the point. What matters is what you do going forward, how you choose to respond to this crisis, and whether you commit to being truthful regardless of the personal cost. I'll tell them everything, he promised. Every conversation with Victoria about your behavior, every time she convinced me to dismiss your concerns, every red flag I chose to ignore. I'll make sure the prosecutors understand exactly how she manipulated our family and maintained her public image. That's good, I said, feeling a small spark of hope for the first time since I'd arrived at the house. Your testimony could be crucial in helping other victims feel safe coming forward. When people see that you're willing to tell the truth despite the personal cost, it validates their experiences and gives them courage to speak up. Other victims, my father repeated, the full scope of Victoria's crimes still sinking in. Children who trusted her, who thought she was there to help them. How many lives has she damaged? How many children have suffered because I was too blind or too cowardly to see what was happening? It was a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life, the knowledge that his failures had enabled Victoria to expand her abuse beyond our family. The children at the shelter, the vulnerable kids who'd been placed in her care, had suffered because the adults around Victoria had chosen to accept her public image rather than investigating concerns about her private behavior. I don't know, I said honestly, but the investigation will uncover the truth. Detective Rodriguez is experienced with these kinds of cases, and she'll make sure that every victim has a chance to be heard. We sat in silence again, both of us processing the magnitude of what had been revealed and what lay ahead. The house felt different now, contaminated by the truth of what had happened within its walls. The carefully curated family photos that lined the hallways seemed like evidence of Victoria's deception rather than documentation of happy memories. What happens to us now? To this house? To the life Victoria and I built together? Everything feels tainted by what I've learned about her. That's something you'll have to figure out, I said, but I'd suggest starting by removing all traces of Victoria's presence from the house. The investigators may want to search for evidence, and you don't want to be seen as protecting her or hiding anything that might be relevant to the case. Remove her things, he repeated, as if the concept was overwhelming. Pack up the life of someone I thought I loved,
Someone I thought I knew? You loved the person you thought she was.
The public image she presented, the role she played in your life. But that person was a fiction, a carefully crafted performance designed to manipulate you and gain access to me and other vulnerable children. How do I tell people, he asked? How do I explain to friends and neighbors that my wife, the woman they've known for years as a pillar of the community, is actually a child abuser? How do I admit that I was so completely fooled by someone I lived with every day? You tell them the truth, I said. You acknowledge that Victoria was skilled at deception, that she fooled many people, including yourself, and that you're committed to cooperating with the investigation and supporting her victims. You don't make excuses or try to minimize what happened, but you also don't accept responsibility for crimes you didn't commit. But I did commit crimes, he said, his voice filled with self-recrimination. Maybe not in the legal sense, but morally. I failed to protect my child, failed to investigate concerns about abuse, failed to prioritize truth over comfort. Yes, I agreed, because accountability was essential for any hope of healing. You failed in your responsibilities as a father. But recognizing those failures and committing to do better is the first step toward making amends. My father stood up slowly, moving like a man who'd aged years in the span of a single evening. I need to call a lawyer, he said. Not for Victoria, but for myself. I need legal advice about how to cooperate with the investigation without inadvertently damaging the prosecution's case. That's a good idea, I said, relieved that he was thinking clearly about the legal implications of the situation. You'll also want to speak with a therapist, someone who specializes in family trauma and can help you process what you've learned about Victoria and your own role in enabling her abuse. Will you come with me, he asked suddenly, to the therapy sessions, I mean? I know I don't deserve your support, but I don't think I can face this alone. It was a reasonable request, but also a complicated one. Family therapy could potentially be helpful in rebuilding our relationship, but it could also become another way for my father to avoid taking full responsibility for his actions. I would need to be careful not to let his emotional needs overshadow my own healing process. Maybe eventually, I said carefully. But first, you need to work with a therapist individually to fully understand and accept your role in what happened. I can't be responsible for helping you process your guilt or shame. That's work you need to do on your own. You're right, he said, though I could see the disappointment in his face. I need to take responsibility for my own healing rather than expecting you to guide me through it. Exactly, I said, feeling proud of him for recognizing that distinction. Our relationship can only be rebuilt if we both do our individual work first. You need to understand how your choices affected me, and I need to continue processing the trauma of what I experienced. I love you, Lydia, he said suddenly, his voice breaking with emotion. I know I failed to show it when it mattered most, but I want you to know that I've always loved you. Even when I chose Victoria's comfort over your safety, even when I dismissed your concerns and enabled your abuse, my love for you was real. I know, I said, surprised by the truth of those words. Your love was real, but it wasn't protective. It wasn't the kind of love that put my needs first or fought for my safety. It was a passive love that hoped for the best, rather than actively working to ensure it did. Can you ever forgive me? He asked, the question hanging between us like a bridge we might someday cross. I don't know, I said honestly. Forgiveness isn't something that can be demanded or rushed. It's something that develops over time through consistent actions and demonstrated change. Ask me again in a year, after you've shown me through your choices that you're committed to being the father I needed you to be. I'll wait, he said quietly. However long it takes, whatever I need to do to prove that I can be better, I'll wait. As I prepared to leave, my father walked me to the door, his steps uncertain and aged. The man who'd greeted me earlier that evening had been transformed by the truth, forced to confront the reality of what his choices had cost both of us. Thank you, he said as I reached for the door handle. Thank you for having the courage to speak the truth even when it meant destroying everything I thought I knew about my life. I didn't do it to destroy your life, I said gently. I did it to reclaim mine and to protect other children from experiencing what I went through. Your life being destroyed was a consequence of Victoria's crimes and your enabling behavior, not a goal of my revelation. I understand, he said, and I want you to know that whatever happens next, whatever consequences I face for my failures, I'm proud of you for finding the strength to speak up. You've become an incredible woman despite having parents who failed to protect and nurture you properly. As I drove away from the house that had been the site of so much pain and deception, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the truth was finally being heard, sadness for the relationship with my father that had been damaged by years of willful blindness, and hope that perhaps, with time and effort, we might be able to build something healthier from the ruins of our broken family. The real work was just beginning. Victoria would face trial, other victims would come forward, and the community would grapple with the reality that someone they'd trusted with their most vulnerable children had been systematically abusing them. My father would have to rebuild his understanding of his own life and choices, while I continued the healing process I'd begun years earlier. But tonight, for the first time in 10 years, I felt like the truth was finally stronger than the lies that had imprisoned both of us. And that was enough to build on. 6 months later, I stood in the marble-floored lobby of the Millbrook County Courthouse, watching as reporters gathered around the entrance like vultures circling prey. The media attention had been relentless since Victoria's arrest, transforming our small town's biggest story into a national conversation about child abuse, institutional failures, and the dangerous power of carefully constructed public images. The trial of Victoria Whitman had drawn attention from child advocacy groups, legal experts, and journalists from across the country. Here was a woman who had built her reputation on helping vulnerable children while simultaneously abusing them. A case that highlighted how predators could hide in plain sight within our most trusted institutions. I adjusted the navy blue blazer I'd chosen for today's testimony, feeling the weight of the moment settling on my shoulders like a familiar burden. After months of depositions, interviews, and preparation sessions with the prosecution team, I was finally ready to tell my story in open court, under oath, with Victoria forced to listen to every word. Detective Rodriguez had kept me informed throughout the investigation, and the scope of Victoria's crimes had grown far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. 7 children from the shelter had come forward with allegations ranging from verbal abuse, emotional manipulation, to physical assault and deliberate medical neglect. 2 former babysitting clients had reported inappropriate punishment methods and threatening behavior children while building a reputation as their protector. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen had spent hours preparing me for this moment, helping me understand how to present my testimony clearly and factually while remaining emotionally composed. The defense would likely try to portray me as a vindictive stepdaughter seeking revenge against a woman who had tried to provide structure and guidance during a difficult time in my life. They would question my memories, suggest that time had distorted my recollection of events, and argue that my medical degree had influenced my interpretation of the hospital records.
Miss Sterling, a voice interrupted my thoughts, and I turned to see ADA Chen approaching with her characteristic brisk efficiency. Sarah Chen was a formidable prosecutor in her early 40s, known throughout the state for her successful prosecution of complex abuse cases. She had silver-streaked black hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp eyes behind designer glasses that missed nothing. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her voice carrying both professional confidence and genuine concern for my well-being. Over the months we'd worked together, she'd become more than just a prosecutor. She'd become an advocate who truly understood the complexity of family abuse cases. "I've been ready for 10 years, I replied, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. It's time Victoria faced the consequences of her actions. "Remember what we discussed about cross-examination," Sarah said, falling into step beside me as we walked toward the courtroom. "The defense attorney, Marcus Webb, is going to try to shake your confidence and make you doubt your own memories. He's skilled at making victims feel like they're the ones on trial." I nodded, having met Webb during the pretrial proceedings. He was exactly the kind of attorney Victoria would hire, expensive and ruthless, with a reputation for destroying witnesses through aggressive cross-examination and character assassination. He specialized in defending clients whose public images were at odds with their private behavior, and he was expert at exploiting the cognitive dissonance that people felt when faced with evidence that contradicted their preconceptions. He'll probably focus on your relationship with your father, Sarah continued, trying to suggest that your accusations are motivated by anger about your parents' marriage rather than genuine memories of abuse. Just stick to the facts, answer only what he asks, and don't let him bait you into emotional responses. What about the other witnesses? I asked, though I already knew most of the answer. Are the children from the shelter going to testify? 3 of them, Sarah confirmed grimly. The older ones who are emotionally prepared for the process. The younger children's testimony has been taken through closed-circuit video to spare them the trauma of facing Victoria in open court. The thought of those children having to relive their trauma for the sake of justice made my heart ache. They were so young, some barely out of elementary school, and yet they had found the courage to speak up about their experiences with Victoria. Their bravery had been instrumental in building the prosecution's case and demonstrating the pattern of Victoria's abusive behavior. And my father? I asked, though this too was a question I already knew the answer to. He's our key witness, Sarah said. His testimony about Victoria's manipulation tactics and his own failure to investigate your complaints will be crucial in establishing how she maintained her facade while systematically abusing children in her care. The months since my confrontation with my father had been filled with painful but necessary conversations. He had thrown himself into therapy with Dr. Patricia Williams, a specialist in family trauma, who had helped him understand the psychology of manipulation and his own role in enabling Victoria's abuse. The process had been devastating for him, forcing him to confront not just his failures as a father, but his fundamental misunderstanding of the woman he'd married. He had also been instrumental in helping investigators uncover additional evidence of Victoria's crimes. He'd provided them with access to family computers, financial records, and communication logs that revealed the sophisticated ways Victoria had controlled information and managed perceptions within our household. His willingness to testify against his own wife had been both legally valuable and personally devastating. Dr. Martinez will testify about the medical evidence, Sarah continued, as we approached the courtroom doors. Her analysis of your hospital records and her explanation of why she didn't pursue her concerns at the time will be powerful testimony about how institutional deference to parental authority can enable abuse. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow seating arranged in an adjacent room where the proceedings would be broadcast on closed-circuit television. I could see reporters filling the back rows, sketch artists positioned strategically for optimal views of the defendant's table, and community members who had come to witness the downfall of someone they had once revered. Victoria sat at the defense table dressed in a conservative gray suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple style that was designed to make her appear vulnerable and sympathetic. She had lost weight during her months in custody, and the carefully applied makeup couldn't completely hide the toll that imprisonment and public disgrace had taken on her appearance. When she saw me enter the courtroom, her eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and something that might have been fear. Marcus Webb sat beside her, an imposing figure in an expensive suit who exuded the kind of confidence that came from years of successful manipulation of juries. He was reviewing notes on a legal pad, occasionally leaning over to whisper something to Victoria, who nodded in response, but kept her gaze fixed on me with inescapable hostility. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the bench. Judge Morrison was known for her no-nonsense approach to abuse cases and her refusal to tolerate attempts to re-victimize witnesses during testimony.
She had already issued stern warnings to both legal teams about maintaining appropriate decorum during what was sure to be an emotionally charged proceeding. The prosecution may call its next witness, Judge Morrison announced, and Sarah Chen stood with practiced grace. Your Honor, the people call Dr. Lydia Sterling to the stand. The walk from my seat to the witness stand felt like it lasted an eternity, though it was probably only seconds. I could feel hundreds of eyes following my progress, could sense the collective intake of breath as the courtroom recognized the significance of this moment. This was the victim's testimony, the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, the moment when Victoria's primary victim would finally tell her story in full. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Words that carried special weight given how many years that truth had been suppressed and denied. As I settled into the witness chair, I caught sight of my father sitting in the front row behind the prosecution table, his face a mask of anguish and determination. Dr. Sterling, Sarah Chen began, her voice clear and professional. Would you please state your full name and occupation for the record? My name is Dr. Lydia Marie Sterling, and I am a practicing physician specializing in emergency medicine at Metropolitan General Hospital. And what is your relationship to the defendant, Victoria Whitman? She was my stepmother from the time I was 13 until I moved out for college at 18. Sarah walked me through the basic timeline of Victoria's entry into our family, her marriage to my father, and the early dynamics of our blended household. These were relatively non-controversial facts that established the foundation for what would follow, and Victoria's attorney made no objections to this preliminary testimony. Dr. Sterling, I'd like to direct your attention to the evening of October 15th, 10 years ago, when you were 14 years old. Can you tell the court what happened that day? This was the moment I had been preparing for, the chance to finally tell the complete story about the night that had changed everything. I took a deep breath and began to speak, my voice steady and clear despite the emotion building in my chest. I had stayed after school to work on a science project with my lab partner. When I arrived home, Victoria was waiting for me in the kitchen. She was holding an acceptance letter from my school's advanced placement program, and she was angry. What was she specifically angry about? She was angry that I had been accepted into the program without consulting her. She felt that I was trying to be better than everyone else, that I was showing off and making the rest of the family look bad. What happened next? She began yelling at me, telling me that I thought I was too good for the family, that I was an ungrateful child who didn't appreciate everything she was trying to do for me. When I tried to explain that the program would help me get into college, she became even more angry. Where did this conversation take place? It started in the kitchen, but Victoria followed me as I tried to go to my room to get away from her. She cornered me at the top of the basement stairs, still screaming about ungrateful teenagers and know-it-all children. What happened at the top of the basement stairs? Victoria shoved me down the stairs with both hands. She pushed me hard enough that I lost my balance completely and tumbled down 15 concrete steps to the basement floor.
A murmur ran through the courtroom at this direct accusation, and I could see Victoria whispering urgently to her attorney. Marcus Webb made a note on his legal pad but didn't object to my testimony. What do you remember about the fall itself? I remember the impact of her hands on my back, the sensation of falling, and then hitting the concrete steps multiple times as I tumbled down. The pain in my shoulder was immediate and excruciating. I lost consciousness when I hit the basement floor. What happened when you regained consciousness? My father was kneeling beside me, looking very worried. Victoria was standing behind him, and she was already telling him that I had fallen, that I had been rushing upstairs and had tripped over my own feet. Did you tell your father what had actually happened? I tried to, but I was in severe pain and somewhat disoriented from the fall. When I said that Victoria had pushed me, she immediately contradicted me, saying that I was confused from hitting my head, that I was trying to blame her for my own clumsiness. How did your father respond?
He chose to believe Victoria's version of events. He said that I was upset and not thinking clearly, and that we needed to focus on getting me medical attention rather than arguing about what had happened. Sarah then introduced the hospital records as evidence, walking me through Dr. Martinez's documentation of my injuries and the medical inconsistencies between our family story and the physical evidence. This was crucial testimony that transformed my personal account into objective medical fact. Dr. Sterling, you're now a practicing physician yourself. Based on your medical training and your review of these records, what do they tell you about your injuries? The bruising patterns on my back are consistent with impact from 2 adult hands. The angle and severity of my collarbone fracture indicates that I was pushed with significant force from above and behind. The secondary injuries I sustained are consistent with being thrown downstairs rather than accidentally falling. In your medical opinion, were your injuries consistent with an accidental fall? No, they were not. The physical evidence clearly indicates that I was pushed deliberately and with considerable force. Marcus Webb's cross-examination was every bit as aggressive as Sarah had warned me it would be. He immediately attacked my credibility, suggesting that my memories had been influenced by years of resentment toward Victoria, and my medical training had biased my interpretation of the evidence. "Dr. Sterling," he began with false courtesy, "isn't it true that you harbored deep resentment toward Mrs. Whitman from the moment she married your father?" I was initially skeptical of any woman who tried to replace my mother. I replied calmly. But I wanted to accept Victoria and tried repeatedly to build a relationship with her. "But you were angry that your father had remarried so soon after your mother's death, weren't you?" I was grieving and confused, but I understood that my father needed companionship and support. "You've testified that you tried to build a relationship with Mrs. Whitman, but isn't it true that you were defiant and difficult from the beginning?" I was a normal teenager dealing with grief and trying to adjust to a new family dynamic. Victoria interpreted any sign of independence or emotional struggle as defiance that needed to be punished. Webb continued this line of attack for nearly an hour, trying to paint me as a vindictive stepdaughter whose accusations were motivated by long-standing family conflicts rather than genuine abuse. But Sarah had prepared me well for these tactics, and I was able to maintain my composure while sticking to the facts of what had happened. "Dr. Sterling," Webb said, shifting to a new angle of attack, "you've had 10 years to think about this alleged incident. Isn't it possible that your memory has been influenced by your subsequent education and your current feelings about Mrs. Whitman?" "My memory of being pushed down those stairs has never changed," I replied firmly. The pain, the fear, the sense of betrayal when my father chose to believe Victoria's lies over my truth, those memories have been consistent for 10 years. "But you acknowledge that memory can be unreliable, especially memories formed during traumatic events?" "Yes, memory can be unreliable, which is why the medical evidence is so important. The physical documentation from that night supports my recollection of being pushed rather than accidentally falling." Webb tried several more approaches, suggesting that Dr. Martinez's medical conclusions were speculative, that the hospital staff had been influenced by my family's dynamics, and that my current accusations were part of an elaborate revenge fantasy. But each attack only served to highlight the strength of the evidence against Victoria and the consistency of my testimony. When Webb finally finished his cross-examination, Sarah stood for redirect, giving me the opportunity to clarify any points that the defense had attempted to muddy. "Dr. Sterling, has anyone pressured you to testify against Mrs. Whitman?" "No, I came forward because I learned that she was being honored for helping children while actually abusing them. I couldn't let her continue to harm vulnerable kids while being praised as their protector." "What do you hope to accomplish through your testimony today?" "I hope to ensure that Victoria faces accountability for her crimes and that other children are protected from experiencing what I went through." My testimony had taken most of the morning, and Judge Morrison called a brief recess before the next witness would take the stand. As I stepped down from the witness box, I felt a profound sense of relief, mixed with emotional exhaustion. After 10 years of carrying this truth alone, I had finally been able to tell my complete story in a forum where it would be taken seriously and acted upon. Sarah Chen squeezed my shoulder as I passed the prosecution table. "You did beautifully," she said quietly. "Your testimony was clear, consistent, and powerful. The jury could see your strength and your commitment to the truth." I took a seat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, directly across from Victoria for the first time since the night of the award ceremony. She was staring at me with undisguised hatred, her carefully constructed mask of respectability completely abandoned now that her true nature had been exposed to the world. The afternoon brought testimony from Dr. Martinez, whose medical expertise provided crucial support for my account of the abuse. She explained in detail how she had documented her concerns about the inconsistencies between our family story and my actual injuries, and how institutional protocols had prevented her from pursuing those concerns more aggressively at the time. "Dr. Martinez," Sarah asked, "based on your examination of the plaintiff on the night in question and your subsequent review of her medical records, what is your professional opinion about how she sustained her injuries?" "In my professional opinion, based on 30 years of emergency medicine experience, the patient's injuries were consistent with being pushed downstairs with significant force. The bruising patterns, fracture angle, and secondary impact injuries all point to deliberate violence rather than an accidental fall." "Why didn't you pursue your concerns more aggressively at the time?" "I attempted to discuss my concerns with the patient's father, but Mrs. Whitman was present during all of our conversations and consistently redirected the discussion back to the patient's alleged clumsiness and behavioral problems. The institutional culture at that time generally deferred to parental authority unless there was overwhelming evidence of abuse." "Do you believe that institutional culture contributed to this abuse going unreported?" "Absolutely. The medical staff noted our concerns in the patient's file, but we didn't have protocols in place for pursuing those concerns when parents presented a plausible alternative explanation for the injuries." Marcus Webb's cross-examination of Dr. Martinez was less aggressive than his attack on me, perhaps recognizing that challenging a respected physician's medical expertise would likely backfire with the jury. He focused instead on suggesting that medical opinions could be subjective and that reasonable doctors might interpret the same evidence differently.
But Dr. Martinez was unshakable in her professional assessment, and her testimony provided the objective medical foundation that transformed my personal account into documented evidence of deliberate abuse. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from 3 children who had been in Victoria's care at the shelter. Their accounts were heartbreaking and powerful, describing a woman who presented herself as kind and caring to the adult staff while systematically tormenting the children when she thought no one was watching. 8-year-old Marcus testified via closed-circuit video about how Victoria had locked him in a storage closet for hours as punishment for minor infractions. 12-year-old Sarah described being denied meals and medical attention when Victoria decided she was being difficult. 10-year-old David recounted verbal abuse and threats that had left him terrified to speak up about his treatment. Each child's testimony followed a similar pattern. Victoria would identify the most vulnerable kids, those who had histories of trauma or behavioral problems that made them less likely to be believed if they complained. She would then subject them to escalating psychological and physical abuse while maintaining a perfect facade in front of the adult staff. Margaret Stevens, the shelter director, provided devastating testimony about how Victoria had manipulated the institutional environment to gain access to vulnerable children while avoiding oversight. She described Victoria's skill at identifying which staff members were most trusting, which children were most isolated, and which situations would provide opportunities for abuse without detection. "Mrs. Stevens," Sarah asked, "did you ever observe anything concerning about Mrs. Whitman's interactions with the children?" "In retrospect,
Yes, there were several incidents that should have raised red flags. Children would become withdrawn after spending time alone with Victoria. Some would flinch when she approached them. A few made vague complaints about her being mean, but they couldn't or wouldn't provide specific details. How did Mrs. Whitman explain these reactions? She was very skilled at providing reasonable explanations. She would say that certain children were testing boundaries, that they were acting out because of their trauma histories, that they needed firmer guidance than other staff members were providing. She positioned herself as the experienced authority who understood how to handle difficult children. Did you ever question her explanations? I should have, but Victoria was so convincing, so knowledgeable about child psychology and trauma responses. She had impressive credentials and glowing references from previous volunteer positions. It never occurred to me that someone with her background and reputation could be deliberately harming the children she claimed to help. Margaret's testimony illustrated how institutional structures and social expectations could enable abuse, even when well-intentioned adults were present. Victoria had exploited the natural trust that people placed in volunteers and the assumption that someone dedicated to helping children must have pure motives. The prosecution's case concluded with my father's testimony, which was perhaps the most difficult for me to witness. Robert Sterling took the stand looking like a man who had aged decades in a matter of months, his face lined with guilt and regret as he prepared to testify against the woman he had once loved. Sarah walked him through the history of his relationship with Victoria, the early signs of problems with me that he had dismissed, and the specific ways Victoria had manipulated him into accepting her version of events rather than investigating my complaints. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah asked, "when your daughter came to you with concerns about Mrs. Whitman's treatment, how did you typically respond?" "I would dismiss her concerns," my father said, his voice barely audible. "Victoria was always present during these conversations, and she would explain that Lydia was being dramatic, that teenagers exaggerate everything, that my daughter was having trouble adjusting to having a stepmother." "Did you ever speak to your daughter privately about her concerns?" "No, I didn't. Victoria convinced me that it would be undermining her authority as a parent figure if I took Lydia's side against her. She said that blended families required unified parental fronts and that my daughter was trying to manipulate me into choosing between them." Looking back, do you believe Mrs. Whitman deliberately prevented you from having private conversations with your daughter? Yes. I now understand that she systematically isolated Lydia and controlled all communication between us. Anytime Lydia tried to speak to me alone, Victoria would find a reason to interrupt or would later convince me that my daughter was trying to turn me against her. "Mr. Sterling, I need to ask you about the night your daughter was injured. What do you remember about that evening?" "I came home to find Lydia unconscious at the bottom of the basement stairs. Victoria was very upset, explaining that Lydia had been rushing upstairs and had tripped. When Lydia regained consciousness and said that Victoria had pushed her, I chose to believe my wife over my daughter." "Why did you make that choice?" "Because I wanted to believe that the woman I had married was good and loving, and because Victoria was very convincing when she explained that Lydia was being dramatic, that Lydia was confused from her head injury and was trying to blame someone else for her accident." "Do you now believe that Mrs. Whitman deliberately pushed your daughter down those stairs?" "Yes," my father said, his voice breaking with emotion. "The medical evidence is clear, and I now understand how Victoria manipulated me into dismissing my daughter's truthful account of what happened." "How do you feel about your role in enabling Mrs. Whitman's abuse of your daughter?" "I feel enormous guilt and regret," my father said, tears streaming down his face. "I failed in my primary responsibility as a father, which was to protect my child. My choice to believe Victoria over Lydia enabled years of continued abuse and allowed Victoria to harm other children as well." Marcus Webb's cross-examination of my father was relatively brief, perhaps recognizing that attacking a broken man who was already accepting full responsibility for his failures would likely generate sympathy rather than doubt. He focused mainly on suggesting that my father's current testimony was influenced by guilt and his desire to make amends rather than accurate memory of past events. But my father's testimony was powerful precisely because of his obvious remorse and his willingness to accept responsibility for his role in enabling Victoria's abuse. The jury could see a man who had been manipulated by someone more skilled than himself, but who now understood the devastating consequences of his failure to protect his child. The defense case was predictably weak, relying mainly on character witnesses who testified to Victoria's public reputation and community service record. Several people who had worked with her at various charitable organizations described her as dedicated, caring, and genuinely committed to helping children. But these testimonials only served to highlight how skillfully Victoria had constructed her public image while hiding her true nature. The contrast between the glowing character references and the testimony of her actual victims made her deception seem even more calculated and disturbing. Victoria herself did not testify, a decision that her attorney had undoubtedly made to avoid subjecting her to cross-examination that would have exposed her manipulation tactics and lack of genuine remorse for her crimes. The closing arguments brought the case into sharp focus, with Sarah Chen methodically reviewing the evidence that demonstrated Victoria's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a woman who built her entire adult life around gaining access to vulnerable children so that she could abuse them while being praised as their protector. The evidence shows that Victoria Whitman deliberately sought out positions of trust and authority that would give her opportunities to harm children while maintaining a public image as someone dedicated to their welfare. Sarah walked through each piece of evidence, from the medical documentation of my injuries to the testimony of the children from the shelter, building a comprehensive picture of Victoria's pattern of abuse and manipulation. The defendant's crimes were not impulsive acts of anger or momentary lapses in judgment. They were calculated, systematic, and sustained over many years. She identified vulnerable children, gained their trust, and then used her position of authority to abuse them while ensuring that any complaints would be dismissed or ignored. The medical evidence clearly shows that Dr. Sterling was pushed down those stairs with significant force. The testimony of the children from the shelter demonstrates a consistent pattern of abuse. The defendant's manipulation of Mr. Sterling shows how she systematically isolated her victims and prevented them from getting help. This case is about holding someone accountable for crimes that were hidden behind a carefully constructed facade of respectability and community service. Victoria Whitman used her reputation as a helper of children to gain access to victims, and she used society's reluctance to believe that such a person could be capable of abuse to avoid consequences for her actions.
Ladies and gentlemen, Webb argued, my client has devoted her adult life to helping children and strengthening families. The accusations against her come from individuals who have admitted to harboring resentment and anger, whose memories may have been influenced by years of therapy and legal coaching. The medical evidence is open to interpretation, and reasonable medical professionals might reach different conclusions about how these injuries occurred. The testimony from the shelter children comes from traumatized individuals whose recollections may be unreliable and whose interpretations of normal disciplinary actions may be distorted by their histories of abuse. But Webb's arguments rang hollow against the weight of the evidence and the consistency of the victim testimony. The jury had heard detailed medical evidence, seen hospital records that had been created contemporaneously with the events, and listened to multiple victims whose accounts corroborated each other despite having no opportunity to coordinate their stories.
The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. As Judge Morrison read the findings, I felt a profound sense of vindication mixed with grief for all the suffering that could have been prevented if Victoria had been stopped years earlier. On the charge of aggravated assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of child abuse in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit child abuse, we find the defendant guilty. The verdict continued through 12 separate counts, each one representing a different victim and a different instance of Victoria's systematic abuse. By the time Judge Morrison finished reading the findings, Victoria had been convicted on all charges, facing a potential sentence of 25 years to life in prison. Victoria's reaction to the verdict was immediate and explosive. She began screaming at the jury, calling them fools and idiots, insisting that they had been manipulated by lies and false evidence. Her outburst only served to demonstrate the rage and entitlement that had always lurked beneath her carefully constructed facade. "You don't understand!" she shrieked as bailiffs moved to restrain her. "These children are damaged. They make things up. They see abuse where none exists. I was trying to help them." Her words echoed through the courtroom, providing a final glimpse of her true nature for anyone who had still harbored doubts about her guilt. This was the woman who had terrorized vulnerable children while accepting community praise for helping them. Her reaction to being held accountable revealed the contempt she felt for her victims. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the immediate impact of the verdict was transformative for everyone involved. The children from the shelter would finally receive the validation and support they needed to begin healing from their trauma. The community would be forced to examine how someone like Victoria had been able to operate undetected for so long. And I would finally be able to close this chapter of my life and move forward without the weight of unspoken truth. The sentencing hearing, a month later, drew even larger crowds than the trial itself. Victim impact statements from the children and their families painted a devastating picture of the long-term damage that Victoria's abuse had caused, while letters of support from the community demonstrated how many people had been deceived by her carefully constructed image. When it was my turn to address the court, I spoke directly to Victoria for the first time since that night at the award ceremony. "Victoria," I said, my voice steady and clear. "You stole years of my childhood and damaged my ability to trust the adults who were supposed to protect me. You convinced my father that I was a liar, that my pain was manipulative theater, that my requests for help were attempts to cause trouble. But you didn't break me. Despite your best efforts to convince me that I was crazy, dramatic, and unworthy of love, I survived your abuse and built a successful life. I became a doctor, someone who helps heal the kind of pain you inflicted on children. And I found the courage to speak up not just for myself, but for all the children you harmed after me. Your crimes have finally caught up with you, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison where you can never again harm another child. That knowledge gives me more satisfaction than you could possibly understand." Judge Morrison sentenced Victoria to life in prison without the possibility of parole, citing the systematic nature of her crimes, the vulnerability of her victims, and her complete lack of remorse for the harm she had caused these children. "Mrs. Whitman," Judge Morrison said as she pronounced sentence, "you have been convicted of crimes that represent a fundamental betrayal of trust and responsibility. You used your position as a caregiver and mentor to systematically abuse children who looked to you for safety and support. The evidence shows that your crimes were not isolated incidents, but part of a calculated pattern of behavior designed to gain access to vulnerable victims while avoiding detection and accountability. You have shown no remorse for your actions and no recognition of the devastating impact your abuse has had on these children's lives.
This court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will never again have the opportunity to harm a child, and society will be protected from your predatory behavior. As Victoria was led away in shackles, still protesting her innocence and blaming her victims for ruining her life, I felt a profound sense of closure. The woman who had terrorized my childhood and abused countless other children would spend the rest of her life behind bars, where she could never again harm another vulnerable person. The aftermath of the trial brought unexpected healing opportunities. My relationship with my father, while still complicated and fragile, began to show signs of genuine improvement as he continued therapy and demonstrated through his actions that he was committed to being the father I had always needed. The community implemented new protocols for screening volunteers who worked with children, and several other institutions began reviewing their safeguarding procedures to prevent similar cases of abuse from going undetected. Margaret Stevens resigned from the shelter and became an advocate for institutional reform, using her experience with Victoria to help other organizations recognize and respond to signs of abuse. Dr. Martinez established a new protocol at the hospital for documenting and investigating suspected child abuse cases, ensuring that medical professionals would be better equipped to protect vulnerable patients in the future. She invited me to serve on the committee developing these procedures, giving me an opportunity to help prevent other children from experiencing what I had gone through. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, I received a letter from one of the children who had testified at the trial. Sarah, now 13 years old and thriving in a new foster placement, wrote to thank me for giving her the courage to speak up about her abuse. Dr. Sterling, she wrote in careful handwriting, "Before you came forward, I thought no one would believe me about what Victoria did. I thought maybe I was making it up or being too sensitive like she always said. But when you saw you on the news talking about what happened to you, I knew that I wasn't crazy and that it wasn't my fault. Thank you for showing me that victims can become survivors and that speaking the truth is always worth it, even when it's scary." That letter sits framed on my desk today, a reminder of why speaking up was worth all the pain and difficulty of reliving my trauma in a public forum. Victoria Whitman had spent years convincing children that they were worthless, that their pain didn't matter, that no one would believe them if they asked for help. My testimony had not only brought her to justice, but had also given her victims permission to reclaim their voices and their power. The scars from Victoria's abuse will always be part of my story, but they no longer define my life or limit my possibilities. I have built a career dedicated to healing others, developed healthy relationships based on trust and mutual respect, and found my voice as an advocate for vulnerable children. Victoria thought she had broken me when she pushed me down those stairs 10 years ago. She thought she had silenced me with her lies and manipulation, convinced me that my truth didn't matter and that no one would ever believe me over her. She was wrong. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and when it does, it has the power to bring justice, healing, and protection for future victims. My truth became a weapon against her lies, and that weapon finally gave me the victory I had been fighting for since I was 14 years old. Victoria will spend the rest of her life in a prison cell, where she belongs. The children she harmed are receiving the support they need to heal and thrive. The community has learned to look beyond perfect facades to protect vulnerable members. And I have reclaimed my voice, my power, and my life from someone who tried to destroy all three.